it's time for us to really break down the different aspects of the actual roast, because when we're designing that profile, we need to understand what each individual phase actually does to the coffee. Now, commonly you would divide the roast into 3 different steps. What we're going to do here is we're going to divide it into a little bit more. So the first phase of the roasting is going to be what we refer to as the before phase. That's basically when we build up the start temperature, we build up the thermal energy, we plan how we're going to release the coffee in, the batch size, and all of those different aspects. The second phase we're going into is going to be what we described as a drying phase. The drying phase is mainly when we have the majority of the water going out of the coffee and we're building up pressure. That will lead into what we call a Maillard phase. This is the yellowing of the coffee, which happens because of the sugar starting to caramelizing. Now, there's a lot of people that will then move into the development time, which is correct. Only what we have to keep in mind is that the Maillard phase actually continues until the coffee is cooled down in your cooling tray. So we're going to come back to this and explain that a little bit more in detail. So after that kind of middle Maillard phase, we're moving into the development time, and then obviously the end of the roast. Now, what I'm gonna do here is to give you a little bit more insight into each and every single step here so that you have sufficient information to be able to decide what you're actually gonna be doing with the coffee. And I think this kind of information and knowledge is really important for you to understand how to actually correctly look at the visual roasting curves that we're going to see when we are roasting together. So in this video, we're doing a general appreciation of the different steps, and then it's going to be followed up by videos where we're roasting and going through into detail how we deal with each individual coffee in the individual steps. Sounds complicated, but we're going to make it really easy for you, so don't worry. Now, for that initial phase, which we call before or starting phase, we need to decide the batch size, which in my case, if you already paid attention to this course, is going to be somewhere between 80% capacity up to 100%. Now, when it comes to start temperature, I am a little bit unconventional. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually dropping in the coffee as soon as the door is going to be closing. So technically, I'm almost dropping in at a negative temperature. Don't worry, you're going to see this live in action very soon so you understand what I'm saying. Basically, what I'm looking at is how do we build up the energy within the drum, looking at that thermal energy, the inlet temperature, and that actual air temperature. I'm not very focused on the bean temperature because it's not going to show me a lot. And when the door is open, before we start to roast, it's going to register the room temperature, which basically shows a very low starting temperature. And the second it's going to close, what's going to happen is that it takes time for it to climatize. So even though I'm going to drop it in directly when the door closes and the temperature probe will show a low value in terms of energy or temperature, the temperature actually is a lot higher than what the probe is reading you, simply because it takes a little bit of time for that probe to catch up. So that's something that we have to keep in mind when we're starting all of those roasts in the later chapters. Now, the first phase here is really important, and it's important for many different ways, and you can get this wrong and right in different ways as well. We have to keep in mind that a lot of different coffees, they behave very differently, so we need to be roasting differently as well. But as a general rule, there's a few things we have to keep in mind. One, there's actually no chemical reactions happening at this stage of roasting. Only thing that is happening is that moisture, water that we measured earlier, is leaving the coffee. And when that happens, we're also building up pressure inside of the bean. And this is really important because the amount of pressure that we have accumulated when we go into Maillard phase is actually going to dictate how efficient the Maillard reaction is going to be. So if we're moving into high, we're actually going to limit that Maillard process. So it's very important that we get in just right. And then the question is, how do we know what right is? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit in the next chapters. Now, you can also move in much too slow. And if you move through the drying phase too slow, you risk having an uneven release of moisture in the coffee, and that is then not going to result in a uniform chemical reaction through that Maillard phase. So the key here is trying to, how do we release all of that water at the same time, which obviously, let's say you were roasting blends or something similar, will be very difficult because coffees will release at different times. So all of this we have to keep in mind. Now, when we move in from the drying to the Maillard phase, there is a bunch of stuff happening. So here is basically where the first chemical reactions are taking place. We're building up new acids, we're breaking them down, we're caramelizing sugars. You're gonna see the coffee is gonna start to yellow, and that's basically the beginning of that caramelization. Now, when you roast, it's very important that you actually mark down this phase. So you wanna go in, make a mark, this is where the coffee turns yellow. Because what we're gonna do in the future when we roast later is to discuss what are the percentages of each of these different phases and what are the actually times and how do they relate together. Now, when we're going through this phase, we're starting to have the buildup of something that is called melanoidins. And these are really important because they develop a lot of flavors. Them together with the Maillard is basically responsible for building up a massive amount of different aromatic compounds. And this is going to make sure that we have a flavor complex coffee. So basically, when we're moving up towards the development time up towards crack, what's going to happen is we're actually building up the possibility for all of those amazing flavor notes to actually shine through in the end of the roast. So it's very important there that we make sure to give that process sufficient time and that we move into a crack in a way that we're going to be able to control that. Because when we move into crack, what happens is that we release all of that pressure. So the pressure that we spent up until then to build up is going to be released. That can be very aggressive depending on the amount of pressure and depending on the structure of the coffee itself. And we have to be very careful because when we go into development time, the Maillard, which has the main impact on overall coffee flavor and taste, is still going on, but it's going to be changing. And it's changing because we have a different introduction of new chemical compounds that's going to change how that Maillard is reacting. We have the breaking down a different acidity structure, we have the breaking down of sugars, and we have an overall pyrolysis happening, which is basically slowly breaking down or killing all the positive notes with the coffee. So when we move into that development time, we have to be very careful. And we have to keep in mind that a lower end temp is always going to result in more residual sugar and a sweeter cup of coffee. So the idea of roasting longer after crack or with a higher end temperature after crack, that generates into a sweeter coffee is actually not true, because we're actually forcing all of those beautiful sugars and everything out. So that phase is for sure going to be the most important one. And again, depending on the temperature we're using, leading up to that point, we're building up different pressures. We get a different reaction to crack. Some coffees crash, some coffees stay up. All of this is based on how much pressure have you built up and how is that release, which can be individual for different styles of coffee. So that is something that we have to keep in mind when we're roasting. Now, when we take out that coffee, we always want to focus more on the end temperature than the development time. It's been proven many times that end temperature is the determining factor for things like colors, also for things of how much sugar do you have left, and where is the acidic structure. So even though development time, of course, is important and relevant and will be discussed in later videos, we're always going to be focusing on that end temp. Basically, if you're coming up to the end of the roast, you see that I have 4 or 5 seconds left to hit that perfect development time based on my reference, but I'm already coming up at my end temperature. You want to release that because you don't want to risk the end temp being too high or too low. Now, when you release that coffee, it's coming out in the cooling tray. Keep in mind that the Maillard reaction is still happening. Amino acids are still changing, sugars are still being broken down. So what you want to do is you want to stop that as soon as possible. Basically cool the coffee as soon as possible, and it's going to taste a lot better. And that goes back to what we talked about in the previous chapters. Make sure everything is clean. Make sure that cooling tray is as efficient as possible. because all of that is going to matter. Now, you finish that batch and you're on the way to the next one. Obviously, what's going to happen here is how you finish the batch before is going to impact the amount of thermal energy you have moving into the next batch, right? So if you're finishing a batch on a very high end temperature with a long development time, let's say you're roasting something very dark, and you go into a new profile versus you've roasted something very light, maybe a filter coffee, and you go into that same profile, you're gonna have two different thermal energies to consider. This is why batch scheduling is really important, and that's something that we are going to take up in the next chapter here as well. For now, this is where we're gonna leave you. Now you have the basic information of what to look for when you create that roast profile, and now it's time for us to individually design that to fit the 4 different coffees that we're gonna be roasting. Thank you.